they shouldn't back off the need to drive short-term answers to key business questions, but they should also take the time to understand the reasons why data teams and technology teams build platforms for the long term.
Welcome everyone to the show. Today we have with us a wonderful guest. We have Randy Bean. He's the CEO and founder of NewVantage Partners, and we'll soon talk about his wonderful book, Fail Fast and Learn Faster. So with that being said, Randy, welcome to the show.
Vishal, nice to see you and delighted to be here today.
Thank you. So walk us through your journey. Like, what brought you to today? Like, explain us your ride thus far.
Yeah, I've been in the data field for longer than I care to mention sometimes, but it's been over a generation. And I started in the context of financial services. By training, I was not a technologist. I was actually trained in the humanities, literature and history, and we'll come back to that later and how I came to write a book. But I was hired by a major bank, a top 10 bank at the time, Bank of Boston, which is now part of Bank of America, founded in 1784. And I was hired to be a COBOL and assembler programmer. I was trained in both of those skill sets. But when I was assigned responsibilities, I was responsible for the bank's deposit accounting history. And what I saw was a vast repository of information on the bank's customers dating back years and years, all of their transactions, their various activities. And I said to my colleagues, what do you do with this information? And their response was, well, the regulators make us hold on to it for 7 years and then we're free to destroy it. And I said, oh my God, what a lost opportunity. And that really set me on the track that I've been on for the past generation, really, which is how can organizations take the data that they have, capture it, and leverage it and analyze it to learn more about their customers, to learn more about their organization, to compete more effectively in a changing environment. And one of the things I'll talk about when we get into the book is the urgency now more than ever for organizations of all kinds, not just businesses, but governments, academic institutions, public health organizations, to be data-driven. So that's a key theme of my book, now more than ever.
Awesome. So walk us through NewVantage Partner. What is that organization? What do you do there, and what it is? Because you founded this, so walk us through some of the history behind that.
Yeah, I founded NewVantage Partners in 2001. So we've been operating for 20 years. We work exclusively with Fortune 1000 companies, engaging at the C-level as senior strategic advisors, but focus exclusively on data and analytics. So as a company, we're focused on 4 things: helping organizations leverage data as an enterprise asset; 2, helping organizations become data-driven; 3, helping those organizations build a lasting data culture that will sustain their efforts to become data-driven; and then 4th, identifying opportunities to innovate with data in their business. So about 80% of our work is with large financial services firms. We work with most of the major banks, insurance companies, asset management, and payment firms. And then the majority of our remaining 20% is with leading healthcare and life sciences providers.
I think, and thank you for walking us through that. So one thing that I found really fascinating in your background. So you said Fortune 100, Fortune 1000 companies you worked with, and primarily those companies are larger, slightly more mature in their establishment. And when you look at the times today, or the challenges that we are facing as a society today, like this, I was talking to a statistician, and he was saying, Vishal, you know what? When as an industry we see one S curve disruption, one S hype curve, it's fascinating. But right now we have multiple technology, multiple business concepts going through their own hype, their own S curve disruptions, and there's a collision between those disrupting trends that are happening, creating a lot of anxiety, lot of shake, lot of um, uncertainty in the industry. From your vantage point, when you look at, say, Fortune 1000 companies, which are based on very strong foundation of the sort of um, mindset, and now when you're seeing this rapid transformation, like basically disrupting industry, what are you seeing some of the trends there?
But one of the main purposes that I try to bring to this book, it's, for a number of years, let me back up a little. I've been writing regularly for the past decade for Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan Review, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal. And it all really began in about 2012, 2013, when big data basically became a household term. Historically, data was really kind of relegated to the sidelines. But then in the early 2010s, the popularity of data increased significantly. And it was at that time that I was asked to write a monthly column on big data for the Wall Street Journal, which I did for 2 years before bringing it over to Forbes. And so what I've tried to do in the book is write from a historical perspective. So basically, what's happened over the past generation, what have we learned, and what haven't we learned? And what are the implications going forward for the coming years, decades, and even next generation? So I'd make a few points. One is that when I first started in the business 35 plus years ago, people were saying, how can we learn more from the data that we have? So they're still asking those same questions. So in many respects, things change, but they also remain the same. One of the things that's happened is data continues to proliferate exponentially, new sources of data, continued growth of data, and also unstructured data, which organizations are really at their infancy in terms of analyzing and mining. So it's one of my contentions, based upon my experience working with these Fortune 1000 companies and also in writing the book, that we're really just at the beginning of the information revolution or the data revolution. It's only within the past decade that leading Fortune 1000 companies have even begun the process of identifying a senior executive at the C-suite level, the chief data officer, to basically be the champion for data or the responsible executive for data within those organizations. And 10 years ago, based upon an annual survey that we do of Fortune 1000 C executives, only 12% of firms had appointed a chief data officer. And today it's roughly 2/3. But at the same time, our survey shows, and also report in the book, that 2/3 of those organizations report that the CDO is still in a nascent stage, struggling with turnover. I wrote a piece in Harvard Business Review 2 weeks ago with a colleague of mine, Tom Davenport, who wrote Competing in Analytics. And the article is called something to the effect of, "Why is the Chief Data Officer tenure so short?" We begin the article by talking about, 25, 30 years ago, people thought that CIO stood for career is over. It's a lot like that for chief data officers now. The average tenure, based upon research that we did with various recruitment firms, is about 2.5 years. Some of the Fortune 1000 organizations we work with are on their fourth, fifth, and sixth iteration of the chief data officer role. I was speaking with a chief data officer for a very large insurance organization who had moved from a top 4 bank about 4 months ago. And this person was noting to me yesterday that that bank had gone through 6 chief data officers. And I said, well, that's precisely the point that I make often when I say sometimes that some organizations are on their 6th chief data officer, they say, you must be exaggerating, but in fact, that's the reality. So just to take a step back, the book is intended to provide a historical perspective because trends come and go, but data proliferates over time, technology and computing power advances. So this is something that's transformational at a cultural and historic level, and it's manifesting itself over a couple of generations.
So let's so we'll talk about the data. We'll talk about the book, right? So let's. What I'm curious to learn from you is, so Fortune 1000 companies, how are they dealing with the current times? How are they dealing with when it comes to the innovation or the disruption that are happening in the industry? If you can walk us through from your vantage point, helping assisting these companies through disruption, through data driven strategies, through building a data driven leadership. What have been your stark observation that you are seeing in current times? Some of the challenges that they're facing.
Yeah, well, one of the major insights of the survey that we conduct each year, based upon our work with Fortune 1000 organizations, are that these companies are really struggling. They're large legacy organizations. They have vast volumes of data, but it tends to be fragmented and siloed. And there isn't necessarily incentives that have been established across the organization to promote data sharing of any kind. So let me just share some data with you. We asked these questions. Are you driving innovation with data? In 2021, only 48.5% of these organizations reported that they were. Are you competing on data and analytics? Only 41.2% indicated that they were. Are you managing data as a business asset? Only 39.3% said they were. Have you forged a data culture? Only 24.4%. Have you created a data-driven organization? Only 24%. So what does that tell us? It tells us that there's a lot of work to be done, but that means there's also great opportunity. So organizations are striving and they're investing significantly in data initiatives and in data technologies and capabilities. But there's many challenges and there's a long way to go before these organizations can say that they're driving innovation, that they're competing on data and analytics, that they've forged a data culture, and they've created a data-driven organization. We can talk about some of those reasons, but the key factor that is creating such a demand for the data profession and the roles of the chief data officer today is that there's so much data out there, but organizations are really not fully capitalizing on the opportunities in front of them.
Interesting. And you talked about high churn rate in chief data officer, right? So you said some of the companies are in their 12th chief data officer roles, and if you talk to many of these data leaders, um, so what has been your observation? Like, why is there is no certainty or there is no stability in understanding a data strategy for these organizations?
Well, first of all, it's a new role. So it's not unusual in that regard because there's no blueprint or playbook to follow. So organizations are figuring it out. I can tell you that a few things. First of all, when major banks first established the chief data officer role in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, for many of those organizations, they thought they could hire a chief data officer and it was like checking a box and magically they would become data driven. And organizations have learned it's not nearly as simple as that. Another thing that's taken place is that organizations have unrealistic expectations of what the chief data officer can achieve. There's been no firm delineation of what the roles and responsibilities of the chief data officer is. Our survey shows that just under half of organizations in just under half of the organizations, the chief data officer is the primary leadership point and central point of responsibility for data, but in more than half of organizations, it's still spread out across other roles and responsibilities, be it the CIO, the CFO, and a quarter of organizations report that there's no single point of accountability. The last point that I'll mention right now is there's very different expectations for what makes a successful chief data officer. And actually, organizations, it's like a pendulum switching back and forth. So many organizations, for example, have looked to bring in outsiders who are data professionals to be external change agent and bring new and fresh perspectives to their organization. But at the same time, other organizations have said, we really need an insider who knows our business and knows how to get things done within our organization. So one of the things that we've seen is an outsider is brought in, but ultimately they fail because the organization doesn't have the appetite to change that quickly. So then the organization reverts to an insider who knows how to get things done internally. but they don't bring that urgency and that change management agenda. So then the organization reverts back to the outsider, and we see this going back and forth. So that's one of the challenges that organizations face. They're really only a decade into this new role, and they're still learning.
So I think so. You brought a very interesting point. So insider, right? So I was talking to one of the Fortune 500 company, defense contractors. They provide weaponry to the U.S. government, and one of their chief data officer. And I was talking, and he was explaining me the misery in something called being data driven, right? So he said, Vishal, this word is thrown a lot. Like even my boss asked me, hey, how can we be data driven, right? But then when you look at the size and, as I said, the maturity of the organization, the culture is very thick when it comes to disrupting and helping them understand like it's like data meeting a story, right? So the story is pretty robust, it has worked forever. Now you're saying, okay, no, there is something called data. It requires a cultural change, it requires a habit change, it requires. So when and I think so when you talk about when you talk to your organizations, when in your experience dealing with these large organizations, what are some of the best ways, some of the best practices that you have seen leaders utilize in getting on this bandwagon of being data driven faster than anyone could? And I'm not saying it's easy, it's definitely hard, but from your vantage point, what are some of the things that you have seen where it works for a leader? If I'm a leader stuck in an organization, how can I be data driven?
Yeah, let me come at this question a few different ways. So first of all, there's no magic bullets and no easy steps, and it's a long-term journey, and it's not a destination either. In other words, it's not a place where you get to and one day you say, I'm data-driven, like king of the hill. You have to stay data-driven. You have to fight and continue to improve each and every day if you want to stay there. And I can talk about some of the more successful data-driven organizations, and those are ones that are always looking over their shoulder, never comfortable, never complacent. And when I worry is when I go into an organization and they say we have it all figured out. I could tell you a lot of stories. I could tell you stories about walking into organizations and meeting with the president of a line of business, and they say, yes, we'd like to bring your team in to work with us because we'd like to be data driven within 60 days. And I just, when I hear that, I say, it's, you really have to reset your expectations, because that's not the way this world operates. But to your point, we ask the survey participants, what's the principal challenge to becoming data-driven? And in 2021, 92.2% of the respondents indicated it was issues relating to culture, organizational alignment, change management, skill set, all of those factors. Only 7.8% point to technology as the primary barrier. So yeah, it represents a change, particularly because working with Fortune 1000 organizations, most of which have existed for generations, if not well over 100 years. They've had ways of operating that's been customary to their business. Data is an asset that flows across an organization, so it impacts everything that an organization does. Often we work with organizations to take them through a data lineage process so they can really appreciate where data originates, where it's consumed, where new data is created. Because up until that point, again, for many organizations, particularly with their executive management, it's a abstract concept. Sometimes executives will say to me, oh, not another data project. And I said, this is not just another data project. This is central to how you do business. If you don't understand who your customers are, if you don't understand how your products and services perform, if you don't understand that the markets that you're participating in or trying to enter into, and if you don't have the data to make those decisions on an informed basis, you're essentially flying blind. So this is not just another data project. This is absolutely existential to your continuity as a business and your future growth of the firm. I mean, look at companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, among others. they didn't exist a generation ago. Now they're among the largest market capitalization firms in the world. So you can be a large bank or insurance company and say, oh, well, I have huge market of customers that have done business with me for generations and generations. But look at Sears Roebuck. They were at top of the heap 25, 30 years ago. So things change. And particularly in this highly dynamic, evolving business environment in the digital age, companies really need to be aggressive about being data-driven, or they're going to face a challenge sooner than later. I have a chapter in the book on disruption, and each chapter begins with a literary quote, because I mentioned my literary background. So the chapter on disruption begins with a quote from Ernest Hemingway from his, I believe it was 1927 novel, The Sun Also Rises. And one character says to the other, how did you go bankrupt? And the character responds, gradually and then suddenly. And that's a great metaphor for disruption, because things can just be sailing along, but there's forces that are operating independent of your business. And at critical junctures in time, those forces can overtake you. So if you're not prepared, if you're not thinking about the future, and if you're not leveraging your data assets to the greatest extent that you can, you may wind up in one of those situations where the disruption comes gradually and then suddenly.
I think that's disruption is again a very interesting word. So basically, I was reading this innovator's dilemma, right? So basically, I really want your perspective on it. So being data driven, right? So what Christensen was suggesting was that, hey, you look at the small trends, you say, okay, let me just make sure no trends get unchecked, and then you see a disruption happening, right? And there's a very small window, sliver window, where you have to react as an organization to grab a disruptive trend. So now I keep quoting this conversation I had with with the BlackBerry, one of the product managers there, right? And he was saying we were hitting all of our numbers. It was like we were data driven. We understand our customers. We had their pulse right, uh, our hand on their pulse. But the whatever the undercurrents were happening, right? It totally missed us by surprise. And if you look at say what data has given us over last 2 years, whether you call it Brexit, whether you call it any elections, and our predictability on what we think could be delivered, it has not given a favorable rating of our reliability on data. So when you look at those two trends, right? When you look at the importance of being data driven, because you have better eyes, you have better reaction abilities, and then you see if your data is your analysis is as good as your data, right? Or as good as the sources you're pulling it from. How do you grapple this phenomena?
Yeah, let me speak to that in two ways. So since you mentioned Clayton Christensen and the Innovator's Dilemma, one of the books that I've always admired is Crossing the Chasm by
Hmm.
Geoffrey Moore.
Hmm.
And so Geoffrey Moore wrote one of the praise blurbs that appears on the back cover of the book. But it's interesting because he looks at all from, he's actually a PhD in English, but he brings this physics mindset. So I just want to read a little bit from his quote, because I think it speaks to your question. So he says, big data is indeed crossing the chasm that separates early adopters from the mainstream of enterprise customers. As Randy Bean makes abundantly clear in Fail Fast, Learn Faster, this crossing is by no means smooth. Through a wonderful horde of business anecdotes, he shows over and over again that the challenge of becoming a data-driven business has little to do with the big data itself. It is only marginally about mastering the technology needed to harness it. Rather, it is primarily about leadership teams finding forcing functions that can drive massive changes in the roles, processes, and systems that make up their enterprise. For some, the forcing function will be regulatory demands. For others, a global market demanding draconian cost reductions. For others, an emerging competitive threat from digital disruptors. And still for others, a mission to solve customer problems that cannot be addressed by conventional means. And then he closes, as a reader of Randy's book, it is your job to determine the forcing function that will drive change through your organization and draw upon this wealth of examples to navigate your way forward. So, so what he's highlighting is, the major transformational context. But to your point about the gap between data and analytics, I try to, in the book, try to illustrate these points through stories. I try to fundamentally be a storyteller. And one of the stories that I tell near the end of the book is that about a decade ago, I happened to be reading, just independent of work, my college alumni magazine. And lo and behold, I saw that a former college housemate of mine had been appointed Secretary of Defense for Research and Development with some astronomical budget of like $2 or $3 trillion or some really large number, and that one of his primary mandates was how to figure out for the Pentagon how to leverage big data. So I dropped him in an email and I said, "Oh, congratulations on your new role. It's been a number of years since we've been in touch, and oh, guess what? This is what I do, big data. And here's a link to some of my articles." And he read a few pieces and he said, "Can you come to the Pentagon to speak to a group in a couple of weeks?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" Wasn't the typical audience that I speak to. I had been on tours of the Pentagon, but that was it. So I flew to DC, went into the Pentagon, went through so many levels of security that I was basically stripped of everything I owned except for my clothes. And I walked into a room and there was about 18 people sitting around a table. About 6 of them had on full stars and bars, military decorations, generals, leaders of that kind. Another half dozen were in camouflage fatigues, and another half dozen were in full-on business suits. I had no idea who was in charge, but immediately they said to me, "The reason why we asked you here is we're executing campaigns, and we spend 80% of our time on data preparation and 20% of our time on analysis to take action. And we'd like to learn how Fortune 1000 companies are doing this, because we assume that they're spending much less time on data preparation." So there were 2 things I learned. First of all, when I would go into American Express or other places and talk about campaigns, they were talking about lift on market generation of new customers. But I quickly realized at the Pentagon, they were talking about drone strikes and activities of that kind, where they needed very precise information to make decisions rapidly based upon limited information. But I also then had to disabuse them of the notion that private industry was doing it any better, that there was any magic or silver bullet, and that the reality was that, at least at that time and for much of the continuing presence, an extraordinary amount of time goes into data preparation, and it's only when those processes are gone through that there's data that's of a quality that can be analyzed. And, we can talk about and debate the points about, how precise does the data need to be? And for marketing campaigns, it can be directional and so forth. But for drone strikes, it has to be pretty precise.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. So whenever I hear a lot of, whenever I hear about the maturity of your understanding of data, right? So I think there's one interesting story that always comes to my mind. I recently started my consulting career, helping businesses understand data and strategize with it. And one of my clients was one of the largest financial services bank, and pretty known for its data, pretty known for its technology. And I went in, I said, "Okay, show me your technology stack, show me your data stack." And they say most of our data is hanging around in Excel spreadsheets. So I said, "Wow!" Like that was after that I start breathing easy and saying, "Okay, don't worry, you'll survive," because I've seen uh, heroes using the bare bone tools survive as well. So I think I totally resonate with what you observed with the Pentagon story there. And I think in other piece I really want your perspective on. So I remember talking to one of the oil rig. So one of the business unit head president, and I think there was some confusion on like how. So their struggle was to increase the collaboration between the data office and the president, like, and basically the business unit in utilizing it insights, right? And basically in one of the conversation, the president and data officer, we sat in the room and we're talking about it. And I said, what are your struggles, or what is your best day? The data officer said, my best day is if this guy talks data, right? I can go home early, life is successful and all that. And then I asked, okay, the president, what is your best day looks like? He said, my best day is if this guy talks English, right? I barely understand what a single word he said. So I think that, and your last story about the importance of story in basically in communicating, that's super critical. So what has been your observation in basically abilities of these business units, these large organizations, in better storytelling to empower their culture? Because you rightly pointed out, one of the leading cause of the confusion is the culture. That's very difficult to shift. So what has been your observation?
Yeah, well, I think that's a exceptional question. Great question. So let me just describe a few stories. So some number of years ago, I went into a large insurance company, met with president of one of their line of business heads. I was with one of my colleagues at the time who was an MIT PhD in high performance computing. So for 55 minutes, my colleague regaled this president, CEO, with the ins and outs of cardinality and ordinality and all types of data types. And it was absolutely brilliant. It was like sitting in a college PhD physics class. And it was absolutely fascinating. I had heard it before, even though I'd heard it many times. I still was able to understand about 20%, but I knew it was absolutely brilliant. So I never said anything through the meeting. The guy asked a couple of questions, but he seemed completely engaged. And at the last 2 minutes of the hour, he turned to me, put his hand on my arm, and he said, so what exactly does this mean? And I said, it means that you can do it faster, cheaper, more cost effectively, and you can do a better job of competing with your customers. And he said, thank you very much. So one of my learnings from that is that ever since I started writing for the Wall Street Journal and subsequently in Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Review and so forth, I always try to, first of all, I'm always writing with CEOs in mind. I'm trying to make complex technology concepts understandable to CEOs. So I joke, but I'm only half kidding. I say that I try to write everything that I write at a third grade level, so that people don't have to guess, they don't have to figure out. It's so abundantly clear. And I guess professionally in my career, that's a thing that I learned early on. It's not about being the smartest person in the room or trying to be smarter than the other person that you're presenting to. It's trying to make sure that they understand. And I had a colleague once many years ago that he would ask technical colleagues to explain something. And they do it the first time, you'd say, I don't understand. And so they do it a second time and say, yeah, I still don't get it. And they go a third time, you go like, yeah, maybe it's me, but I'm not really getting it. And it absolutely forced them to put it in as plain a term, so ultimately it becomes understandable. And when I'm interviewing client organizations for case studies, whatever I'm doing, I will ask the same questions 10 times until it can be translated into something that's understandable. And I wrote the book really for three audiences. One is I wrote it for business executives, C-level executives, CEOs, board members, so they could understand really what the impact and why data was critically important to their organizations. I also wrote it for general readers who have been hearing all about positive data for positivity rates for COVID and the need to develop new vaccines and how all the data is organized. So there's been more information, more data about data in the news over the past year or 2 years than any other time in history, be it even political polls and political campaigns. Like how do they say this person's leading or that person's leading? So I really tried to write it for the general reader so they understood what the fuss was about. And then I also tried to write it for data practitioners. And what I did in that context is I provide case studies from roughly 25 Fortune 1000 organizations so that those who want to dig deep can look at specific examples of what organizations like American Express, Capital One, MasterCard, Travelers, organizations of that kind are doing to be successful and differentiate themselves.
Interesting. So it's a nice segue. So let's get on the book, the meat of the stuff. So, by the way, fascinating title. Um, Tell us the story behind the title. Fail fast, learn faster.
Yes, it's actually, so I'll give you the little bit longer story. So I mentioned studied literature when I was in college, and a few years ago, I also like to watch professional tennis, and I traveled to Paris, I think, to see the French Open, and they had the Swiss tennis player, not Roger Federer, the other one, Stan Wawrinka, and he was in the finals, and I noticed this massive tattoo up and down his arm, but it was writing. And I was trying to get a glimpse and see what it was. And then I saw what it said was, ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. And I said, like, wow, where did that come from? And I looked it up. And it was actually the Irish playwright Samuel Beckett, who's most known for writing the existential play, Waiting for Godot. So I thought that this was a tremendous metaphor for what organizations really need to do to become data-driven. They can't wait. They can't, experience analysis paralysis. Perfection is the enemy of good. That's another quote from the French writer Voltaire. But the point is that organizations need to take action, and I can elaborate on that. And action is really a fuel for innovation. And that, Paul Sappho, the futurist, states that failure is the foundation for innovation. So that's really and in data science, there's the notion of test and learn. So all of these ideas of iterative learning, shorter cycle times lend itself, and that's where I came up with the title, Fail Fast and Learn Faster. And it's really kind of a mantra or a manifesto, a call to action for organizations to take action, learn from their experiences, and keep on going and sustain their efforts for the long term.
Interesting. And why write this book? Like, so there's a lot of books on data nowadays, and basically pushing this idea of data literacy and be data aware. I'm curious, like, what made you write this book?
Yeah, a couple different reasons. One is that I had resisted writing a book for a number of years. Publishers had reached out and saying, you're writing all of these articles. I was forced to count them fairly recently. Somebody said, how many articles did you write? And I said, I think it's 150, and I actually counted them. And this was back in March or April, and it was like 156. I was just guessing. But by now it's about 175 in those publications. So I had been asked to write a book, and I said, if I'm going to write a book, I want to write War and Peace or The Great Gatsby or something of that kind. I don't think I want to write a book on data. But COVID came along, and you couldn't travel, and was heading to a long, dark winter last year. So I said, yeah, I will do the book. I'd never done a book before. I was used to writing the articles. They said, can you get us a half manuscript in 3 months and a full manuscript in 6 months? And I said, probably. I've never done it, but I assume I can. I spent about a month thinking about the structure of the book, but when I arrived at the structure, I started writing, and basically I gave them a full manuscript within 6 weeks, which they accepted. And so the whole publication date was accelerated by half a year. But one of the driving themes was the urgency. And so I just want to read from the very opening lines of the book, because I think this sets the tone. It begins, the world is in a race to become data-driven, now more than ever. The warp speed effort to organize scientific and epidemiological data from across the globe in a heroic effort to find a COVID-19 vaccine has illustrated the urgency and existential nature of this quest. We need data, science, facts, knowledge, and insight to make informed, wise, and critical decisions. Now more than ever, data matters, and having good data matters tremendously. So that's really a driving theme throughout the entire book, that data and becoming data literate and becoming data driven is not a luxury. It's not something to say, oh, we're going to put that somewhere on the priority list for 2023 or 2024. If you're not doing it today, if you don't have a sense of urgency, then God help you.
So by the way, one little joke on your book. So I was discussing within my team, and one of my marketing person said, Vishal, you know what? How can I make this book better to resonate with Fortune 1000 companies? I said, how? He said, just lose the L in learn. So it just reads fail fast, earn faster. So I said that's brilliant. So
Sure,
this
yeah, no, that's right. Yes.
so anyways, thank you for walking us through that. So now, I think let's talk about maturity a bit. I think the when I was reading this book, I think what stands out is your urge to helping basically tell business you have to be data driven, you have to understand your data, you have to understand your silos. So from that aspect, over last 20 years or how many years you have been helping assisting these businesses, how have you seen the understanding of maturity evolve for these organizational leaders? Like, can you walk us through that?
Yeah. I say a few things, and that is that maybe this speaks to recommendations for success. I think that organizations, from my experience, have to be very focused on business value. Often or sometimes, or often there's an inclination to create technology. I won't say for the sake of creating technology, but sometimes it's building the perfect platform that's going to serve an organization for a long period of time. But the problem is that business executives get measured in quarters, okay? So there is no long period of time if you don't achieve success from quarter to quarter. So it's very common for me to go into organizations and meet with their data teams, and they tell me all about the robust capabilities they've created, and they're justifiably proud of those capabilities. Then I'll meet with the technology organization, and they'll share with me the architecture and platform and engineering, and it's very robust, and they're very proud of what they've created, and they talk about how it provides a long-term platform for the future. And then I go and meet with the line of business executives, the presidents of the line of business who have ultimate responsibility. And they say the truth of the matter is that we don't have confidence in our data. We don't trust the data that we're receiving. We're not always receiving the data that we need to make the decisions that we make. We're not receiving the data that we need with the timeliness that we need to make these decisions, particularly in a digital world. So what we see is this gap between the business decision makers that have to yield these quarter-to-quarter results and teams that are creating capabilities that may well serve the organization for the long term, but there's this gap between translating that into business value in the short term. So one of the things that we continually advise organizations to do is begin by identifying one simple business question that you're not able to answer today, and identify what is the data that you need to answer that question. You don't need all of the data. You don't need a full universe of data. You might just need a handful of information or vectors to be able to make that determination. So provide that data, allow the business person to answer that question, and that establishes an initial level of trust and credibility. And then working with the business owner or executive, identify a second key business question that's unsolved. And then again, repeat that process. By repeating that process, it builds trust, it builds credibility. And when you repeat it multiple times, then it builds momentum. So we see successful organizations as having established that credibility, trust, and momentum, but it really happens one step at a time. And it really starts small. Somebody said, well, how does that correlate with your title, Fail Fast, Learn Faster? And I said, I didn't say anything about starting small. You have to start somewhere to get big, regardless of, Amazon, Jeff Bezos started in like a tiny office, 25 odd years ago. So, so sometimes you just need to start small to build that credibility and trust, and then you can create that momentum that creates the escape velocity, to quote Jeffrey Moore again.
So I think that's a fair point. So if I'm a leader, listening to this conversation, what advice would you give? And I'm not a data scientist. I'm probably the dreamer. I'm the guy who's making life harder for a data scientist to live in this organization. So how would you? Because I think if you talk to the data side of the world, right? um, they all complained about trust, right? They all complained about how much the other business units are either not sharing data or not collaborating effectively, or they don't see our value fast enough so they can collaborate with us better. And it's a constant back and forth between the business units and these data offices. So what would you tell to the leaders? Like how would they make that cultural shift that is needed, that what your book demands basically from these organizations?
Yeah, I think both sides need to put themselves in the other side's shoes fundamentally. So business leaders, they can't and they shouldn't back off the need to drive short-term answers to key business questions, but they should also take the time to understand the reasons why data teams and technology teams build platforms for the long term, how they'll be better served ultimately. The data and technology organizations need to really appreciate the fundamental short term, quarterly nature of business and business profits, and they might not like it, but it's the reality. And if your organization is not able to demonstrate those short-term results, as mentioned before, there isn't a long-term. It's funny because it hasn't happened this time around, but back in when the financial crisis came in 2008, 2009, and the major financial services companies had to lay off hundreds of thousands of people, I often saw the data scientists among the first to go, or what was then the equivalent of the data scientists, because they weren't contributing something in many instances that had immediate value today in that moment. It was just people that were providing some piece of work that had immediate value to basically keep the company in business and keep the doors open tomorrow. So fortunately, we haven't been in that situation over the past close to 15 years now since then. But yeah, when push comes to shove and you get into really difficult situations, unless you can explain why you're adding value to today, you might not have a role. We're in a fortunate and luxurious situation now. The data profession is rich and robust and booming, but times change and we don't always have that luxury.
Yeah, no, I think it's funny. So about 10 years back, whenever you talk to data scientists, like it's what's funny, like how many of these guys used to say, "I'm just an insurance policy for my CEO." Right? My role is just so he messes up, I'll get the boot. Everyone is happy. So I just have to stay long enough that he doesn't mess up long enough, so I can have a career in this organization. So it was hilarious. Now we don't hear it. I think that's a good sign that at least the organization are getting. I think right now you can say chief security officer are those roles, but it's getting mature when it comes to understanding of what data is. So by the way, so thank you so much, Randy, on walking us on the book. Now let's get on the next segment. We call it rapid fire. So basically, we want this is so how it works is I'll usher something. Tell me what comes first thing that comes to your mind. Should we
Sounds
should we
good.
play? Awesome. So machine learning.
Yeah, well, machine learning is basically a way. Do I have to give a short answer?
Yes.
Well, machine learning is what most organizations are doing when they use the term AI.
Fair point. Technology.
Technology changes everything, but it always has to deliver business value.
Leadership.
Leadership is what differentiates those companies that succeed over the long term from their competitors.
Future of work.
I have no idea. Well, I will say one thing. One of the things that's become pretty evident is they had a great piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, which talked about people that live in, say, big cities where standard of living's high, New York, Boston, San Francisco, and now the people are working remotely, from like ski resorts or islands, and they're saying, well, we don't have to pay you those big salaries anymore. So the reality is remote work is going to change everything. People can probably be far more productive, but it's also people are going to start to think about the economics of it too and say, well, if you're working remotely and when you don't have meetings, you're out surfing or things of that kind, we're going to pay you the same way or not.
Fair point. Culture.
Culture is the heart of everything. It's the heart of my book. It's the core chapter in the center, and really, culture. Each organization has its unique culture. There's no one size that fits all, and for any organization to be data driven or to transform in any way, they really have to have an inherent understanding of their culture and how they can leverage that.
Digital transformation.
Well, digital transformation really goes hand in hand with data. There's data that exists outside of digital transformation, but the two initiatives are so intertwined in every regard. So, in many respects, data is the fuel that enables so much of digital transformation.
Disruption.
Yes, disruption is what takes you from the safe way of today to the scary way of tomorrow. Disruption, that's how cultures, societies, businesses move forward. It's through periodic disruption.
Future of organizations.
Future of organizations, I don't have an opinion except for beyond the increase in remote work.
Data-driven leader.
Yeah, I look at organizations like Capital One and compare those with the other major banks who have existed for generations and generations, if not centuries. Capital One is approximately less than a generation old. They started as data analytics leaders that brought the data and analytics mindset and way of thinking to financial services, and they've become certainly one of the most dominant U.S. banks in the credit card market, and have really set an example for how a traditional industry like banking can be completely disrupted and innovative by new competitors.
Awesome. So, with that, thank you so much for playing with the rapid fire. Now we're at the tail end of the conversation, and I want to spend few minutes on your journey. So, basically, we ask all of our guests to share some of the things that has helped them become successful, or that has really contributed to their success. What are some of those qualities that has really helped shape you what you are today?
One I'd say is finding great mentors who will give it to you straight and you can learn from. It's not always what you want to hear, but it does you good to listen and learn from that experience. Number two is surround yourself with people that are much brighter than you are. I always tell people that I'm like the least intelligent person in my firm. A number of my colleagues are past and present are MIT and Yale PhDs, and they're almost all C executives with deep backgrounds, both educational and business wise. So surround yourself with people that are smarter than you are.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So, some of your favorite reads, some of the favorite books that have inspired you, or that you're reading right now.
Well, that's kind of funny because I it's rarely that I read business books, so that's kind of funny. But I read a lot of literature because that's what I studied in history. So be it things that range from, and people say, do people really read those books? But I do. War and Peace, The Great
Mm.
Gatsby, Moby Dick, the French writer Camus, any of his works, The Stranger, The Rebel, The Fall. the plague. Yeah, there's so many great writers writing today. There's a lot of great historians. Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. There's lessons in that for all of us. So I'm just a great fan of literature and history because I find these things that have been written generations, centuries, or thousands of years ago hold lessons for us today.
Interesting. Thank you for walking that. So now, as a closing remark, so if you want something for that our listeners and viewers can take away from the conversation, what would that be? What would be your closing thought?
Yeah, I believe in the power of telling stories. That's what I tried to do in the book, Fail Fast, Learn Faster. I think stories bring things to life. It puts things in human terms. You asked me earlier, well, aren't there a lot of data books? I was trying to write a data book that transcended the genre, so to speak. It's not a data book for data geeks. Data geeks can find a lot of good stuff in there, but it's really written for a wide audience so that anyone and everyone can really understand the opportunities and the challenges presented by data.
Awesome. With that, thank you so much, Randy, for spending your time with us, and thank you for the amazing book. So, I'm curious, what's next on the book?
I'm just doing a lot of speaking and presenting to different audiences. I'm doing a lot of executive sessions for Fortune 1000 companies, meeting with their executive teams to really share my experiences and the learnings and the stories of the book. And that's one of the things that's most gratifying.
Awesome. So,
Beyond-
if someone is interested, where can they reach you?
Yes, I invite you to follow me on LinkedIn, Randy Bean. Just go on LinkedIn and you'll find me. On Twitter at Randy Bean NVP. NewVantage Partners, www.newvantage.com. And there's also the 150 plus articles I mentioned, plus the 10 years of the executive survey you'll find there, plus a number of podcasts with Harvard Business Review and Sloan Review and other places. So those are some of the best ways to find me.
Awesome. With that, Randy, thank you so much, and wish you nothing but success on the book. You're always welcome back on the podcast, sharing your journey, and lovely to have you on the show.
Vishal, it was a pleasure and great questions. I enjoyed every minute of it.
Thank you so much.